Welcome to the Transforming Trauma podcast. Transforming Trauma is presented by the Complex Trauma Training Center. I'm your host, Emily Ruth, and I'm so glad you've joined us today. Hi, Transforming Trauma listeners. If you're a mental health professional working with complex trauma and are interested in learning the neuroaffective relational model, we're excited to share with you about our upcoming NARM therapist trainings. The NARM therapist training is an advanced clinical training designed for licensed mental health professionals, current mental health graduate students, and active clinical interns and trainees, where you will get trained in a comprehensive developmental framework and clinical approach for resolving the long-term impacts of ACEs and CPTSD. As you are learning and integrating NARM, you will receive individualized support from a team of skilled, passionate, and supportive trainers, led by faculty members Brad Kammer, Stephanie Klein, and Marsha Black. If you're working in the field of complex trauma, we encourage you to register now to get trained in NARM. For more information and to reserve your spot, please visit complextraumatrainingcenter.com. And now for our interview. Alexander Vesely is an award-winning documentary filmmaker, licensed psychotherapist specializing in logotherapy and existential analysis, and the grandson of Dr. Viktor Frankl, author of the classic Man's Search for Meaning. Vesely serves as director of the Viktor Frankl Media Archives in Vienna, co-founder of the Viktor Frankl Institute of America, and the director of the Online Academy for Logotherapy at the Elizabeth Lucas Archive. His work uniquely bridges the worlds of psychology and cinema, carrying forward his grandfather's legacy through both film and therapeutic practice. Vesely's films, such as the acclaimed Victor and I and Wizard of the Desert, explore the lives and philosophies of influential figures of psychology, earning international awards and recognition. Beyond the screen, he is a sought-after speaker on meaning-centered psychotherapy, teaching and lecturing worldwide. Vesely lives in Vienna with his wife and son, where he also maintains a private psychotherapy practice. This conversation was such a pleasure, and I'm so glad to share it with you. Here's my interview with Alexander Vesely. All right. I'm sitting here with Alexander Vesely, and I'm just so excited for this conversation. Welcome to Transforming Trauma.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah. I'd really love to begin just, in the space of curiosity around what you would like our listeners to come away with from our conversation today.
Yeah, well, so if we're probably going to talk about my grandfather's work, so Viktor Frankl's work, which I always encounter, and I'm always surprised if I go someplace or other countries and people tell me, oh yeah, I read the book in high school, or yeah, the book, he wrote 33 books. So sometimes I jokingly ask, which one? So, but of course I know it's usually Man's Search for Meaning, which is the book that he's best known for, and which is a personal recounting of his experiences in the concentration camp. But surprisingly, he never saw that as his most important book. In fact, when he came out, he didn't even put his name on it because he didn't see that as so significant. The book he found was important was the one you'll read about in Man's Search for Meaning, which only existed as a manuscript when he went into Auschwitz and had to throw that away. And what was in this manuscript was his collection of ideas and the foundation of his psychotherapeutic school, which he called Logotherapy, from the Greek word logos, which means the word, but also meaning, and therapy, healing. So it's about healing through meaning. It's a meaning-centered psychotherapy. And this was ready when he had to undergo the unfortunate part of his life that had to do with the Holocaust and losing his family. And too little is known, I think, today about not Viktor Frankl, the Holocaust survivor, but Viktor Frankl, the founder and one of the last founders of a comprehensive school of psychotherapy, which included a whole foundation of a concept of human existence and what it means to be human, what it means to be healthy, what the things are that keep us healthy, and which is radically different and was radically different at the time he developed it from all the other schools of thought that were out there. And sometimes, as a logotherapist myself, I see now 80, 90, 100 years later almost. I mean, we're talking 1926 when he first came up with his ideas. And I see now that a lot of these thoughts or other schools are arriving at the same insights that he had 100 years ago. And they're now only discovering that, hey, we could use that, or, we get to talk more about that. So, and I think it's good, but it's also a little bit sad because there were generations of logotherapists that have built on his work and refined it and used it successfully. And so little is known, especially in North America and Europe, lots of countries in Europe. So little is known about logotherapy. And I'm here to perhaps change that.
Oh, I just got chills when you were talking about it's almost been 100 years.
Yeah.
And like you said, this wisdom, this deep wisdom has been in existence, and so many folks aren't aware of it, haven't heard of it, and maybe just now we're kind of coming into contact with different models that maybe are inspired or, it's in the field, this wisdom. And so I'm really excited to hear more. So as you mentioned, you're a psychotherapist.
Mm-hmm.
But you have lots of work that you do. So I wonder if any listeners who maybe aren't familiar with your work, they're familiar with grandfather's work, but could you share with us a little bit about your background and how you came to this?
Well, yeah, I came through it not through the obvious way, which is just, knowledge being handed down by my grandfather. That too, of course, but indirectly. I was always interested in media and film, movies, and that kind of stuff. And one day, I asked my grandfather just casually, what's going to happen with all these tapes? Because he had this one room in his apartment. It's filled up to the roof with tapes and stuff. Mm-hmm. And what's going to happen with those? And he said, nothing, but don't you touch them because I got my system here. So he was very orderly. And so I said, well, these are going to turn into vinegar if we just leave them here. And so he allowed me to start copying them and make digital copies of them. I was a teenager when that started, and I basically did it just to save them. I wasn't really interested so much in what was on those tapes. But I thought, it's grandpa talking in the 50s and 60s, so it would be a pity if it got lost. But by listening to the tapes, which was unavoidable, I learned a lot. And I basically learned logotherapy kind of firsthand through those tapes. And the archive that kind of got its own dynamics. And over the decades, really, I have continued digitizing those recordings and video recordings. And thankfully, he lived in a time where the technology was already there. So he could record himself, or people would send in recordings. And that's good because, a lot of times people speculate or they ask me, what would he say about this or that? I can say, well, actually, I can tell you exactly what he would say because he did comment on this or that. Yeah.
That's so cool.
So that's how that happened. But the love for film was always there, and for documentaries. And I then started doing a documentary about my grandfather because people were telling me these stories. And they said, your grandfather, I met him in the 60s and we worked together. And they would tell me these very insightful anecdotes, or sometimes just silly anecdotes, but that also tells you something about a person. And so just from this spirit of archiving stuff, I thought, well, that's a pity if these stories are lost. And so I started recording these interviews and getting to hear about sides of my grandfather that I hadn't experienced personally. I knew him for 23 years of my life, which is a long time. So he's still so present in my memory that I can put him in the room. But of course, it was the last 23 years of his life. And there were some things that changed, or, people change, especially people who are multifaceted. And so it was a very interesting project that I continue to this day. So when people approach me and they say, I knew him, I had some interaction with him, I ask them to sit down in front of my camera and record those.
Yeah, that's so touching just to think about what that experience was for you. So you're saying your interest in filmmaking and sort of documenting these conversations led you to the field of mental health and psychotherapy.
It's always been both. I think there is a connection there, which is life is also an experience. It's not just knowledge, and psychotherapy is an experience. If you think of, what changed your life is usually connected to some experience. It can even be the experience of having some, I think Bula called it the aha experience, that aha moment where you realize something. So that's always connected. And how can you create an atmosphere where growth is possible, or where ideas come? And I think one of the beautiful things and powerful things about film is that when you're talking with somebody about a film, you're both on the same level. You're both talking as, film critics or as an audience who has seen that film. So you can talk about topics not from, I'm the expert and I'm telling you, but we're both talking about a story or aspect of a film that can be the story, but there are other aspects to it. There's the visual element, there's the music. Where was this film shot? Some people like films because they say, oh, this was shot in a place I'm familiar with, and that puts me back there. So that element of experience is always there, and films have impacted me deeply, and they have that power to impact people. So I think film can be therapy, and so I think that's really the connection there.
Mm-hmm. There's part, as you're talking, I'm just like there's a curiosity I have, and I want to talk more about logotherapy, because obviously that's really, that's a beautiful intention to want to share that.
Sure.
And also there's part of me that's curious, at what point, listening to these tapes, and like you said, it was both. It was always your interest in filmmaking, but also, the experience and psychotherapy kind of in that way. Mm-hmm. But I'm curious, like, when did you first realize the impact of your grandfather's work? I'm wondering if it was while listening to these tapes, or at what point did you?
You mean the impact in the world?
Yeah.
I saw that he was recognized in the world when he was around still, because he was constantly traveling, and, the phone would go off and the people would invite him. So, and of course he would talk about, patients and experiences, and people had written to him, and he would always point out the remarkable stories. So, if tragedy hit somebody, how did they deal with it, and how did they deal with it in a meaningful way? So he was always zoomed in on that. So it was a very positive learning environment to be around him. And so I knew he wasn't that famous in Austria, paradoxically, which I think he enjoyed, because he always said, well, I can go on the street and go unrecognized. And so that was fine. It's changed since, but it was different at the time. So I knew that he was a well-known figure, at least in parts of the world, but I wasn't really interested in why. I have to admit, for me, it was Grandpa, and that was enough. And he was funny, and it was witty, and there was not so much interest on my part on what he was talking about. That came with the recordings. And when I got interested and I pursued studying therapy, the most I learned about logotherapy was when I was in school, learning about all the other schools and seeing what logotherapy was not. Because when I listened to those tapes, most of what he talked about, and that's actually an experience a lot of people tell me that they have as well, most of the things I thought, well, that's, of course, it's natural. That resonates with what I intuitively think about, a problem or life, or what matters in life. And even he said, I haven't invented anything new. I really just took that concept of, meaning, and how important meaning is in life, and that we are meaning-oriented beings, and that meaning has a central role, and that you just cannot leave that out. And out of therapy, and, meaning had been everywhere. It's been in religion, in poetry, and literature, and music, but not in psychotherapy, not in psychology, not at the time. It was all about, ego, serving the ego, or maintaining inner balance, or whatever. And so to me, that was really natural, but only when I learned all the other schools, like, really? You're not talking about meaning? You're really going after, I don't know, psychodynamics, and assuming that it's the biggest achievement a human being wants to achieve in their life is equilibrium, is balance, or all their needs being fulfilled. And so I learned more about logotherapy there. And that's when I realized, okay, what he had to add, I think it's important to say, because he wasn't designing anything, he wasn't saying, oh, all the other schools are not correct, or, to dismiss them. Logotherapy is so beautifully compatible with all these other schools, because he doesn't deny, well, we are in part driven by drives and instincts. I mean, Freud was right. There's our unconscious. It goes very deep. A lot of decisions that we make them unconsciously for reasons we don't really know. Behaviorism is right. We have a lot of stuff that we learned, and we learned what's good and what's bad by punishment and reward. That's all there. It's undeniable. And if you had a very bad children, if you had, big trauma, can that affect you later on? Of course, absolutely. No denying in that. But the problem he saw was with these models at the time was they were generalizing. They were saying, and that's the whole story. There's nothing but. That's the human being. Drive and instinct, or learned and dislearned behavior, or genes. I mean, nowadays we have that discussion again as we discover that so much is in our genes, which is wonderful. And in our microbiome, all those genes that are not even our genes live in our body, right? That steer our behavior. It's fascinating. But again, it's not the whole story. And he said there's something more to human existence. And he called that the noetic dimension, the intrinsically human core that's beyond sick and healthy, which is the person that you are versus the psyche that you have, or the emotions, the cognitions, and the body that you have, or the illness that you have, as a matter of fact. That person that you are and that cannot become sick. And ultimately, it's still you as a human being who decides, what am I going to do with this? So we are not free from conditions, but we are free always to decide what we're going to do about them, what attitude we're going to adopt towards these conditions.
Oh, yeah. I so appreciate the richness in that, and that you're bringing this forward. Um, yeah, thank you for that.
That's logotherapy in a nutshell there.
Yeah, that was beautifully said.
Call it a day now.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'd love to hear more. Tell us more about this noetic dimension that you spoke of.
Well, so noetic dimension sometimes is a spiritual dimension, but you have to be careful there. He wrote his books in German, and there's one word in English, spiritual, but for that word, two words exist in German, and they're very different. One is geistig and one is geistlich. And that little sound at the end makes all the difference, because one has a religious connotation, geistlich, right? And geistig does not.
Mm-hmm.
In English, I think spiritual always has a religious connotation, or it can have that. It has that.
Mm-hmm.
And that has led to a lot of misunderstandings, of course. And so he would then say, okay, I have to call it something else, because otherwise they're going to think I'm proposing something religious here, or a religious form of therapy. And so he came up with the word noetic from the Greek word nous, which also means spirit, but more in the sense of cognition, of that ultimately essential humanness, the human core that makes us humans different from, say, a plant or an animal,
Wow.
right? Noetic. And so that's why in English especially, he would call that the noetic dimension. It's who we are. If you look at it, then of course we have two other dimensions. We have our body. Our body influences our behavior. We have our psyche, right, which includes the cognition and emotion. And there, of course, miles of books have been written about what can happen there and what can go wrong, and how to fix things there. But he said, ultimately, I'm more interested in the human core, in the noetic dimension, in the person who is dealing with their psyche, with their body, because only humans, as far as we know, have that ability, for example, to act not in parallel, in accordance with what their body and their psyche is telling them, but to act against that. We have that freedom. We have that freedom of will. It's one of the basics of logotherapy, that assumption that there is freedom of will. And a human being can say, for example, I'm hungry, my body feels hungry and my stomach is aching. My psyche is acting parallel. Body and mind always go parallel, right? We know that. Psychosomatic, right? Medicine. Mm-hmm. So I fantasize about food, right? All I can think of is, where can I get some calories? So that can be the case. But a human being can still say, but I will not eat. Because, say, for example, I'm in hunger strike for something that I find important, for a value that's bigger than me, for something that I recognize as more important than myself and my life. And therefore, I'm not going to eat. And people have done that. And the human being can decide not to eat until they're dead, if they see a meaning in it, if they find it meaningful. And that's the powerful pull, he would say, of meaning, that once we as meaning-oriented beings recognize something that's of importance, that is more important than ourselves. And he would say that normally a healthy human being is actually oriented outward towards the world, towards important tasks, or other people, right? If I love another person, that's meaning implicit. And we want to be good for something. It's not about feeling good. That's what Freud proposed, and what so many other schools still try to achieve today. Is like, oh, it's all about feeling good. But everybody wants to feel good. And he said, no, a healthy human being actually doesn't care so much about their own feelings. They want to achieve something meaningful. They want to put some meaning to their existence and say, I was good for this thing. And that got done. That got fixed. Something that was necessary, something that was maybe bad. And I turned it around, and now I changed the world and it became a better place, or I was there for that person, and not using the world, so to speak, right, in order to fix some inner equilibrium or needs, right? The pleasure drive, Freud, or the drive for power, Adler, right? Tell that to any parent, right? Would you say, oh, a mother sitting by the bedside of their sick child? I mean, that's not fun, right? They're just doing that so they can, I don't know, call themselves a good parent, or feel good about their ego. right? No, they care about that child. They care about the task at hand, that what needs to be done, what should be. It's not just what can be, but what should be done, and that they're there for that other person. My grandfather called that self-transcendence, the transcending of the own, taking the gaze away from one's own navel, right? And
Mm-hmm.
looking into the world. And he said that's the healthiest state that we're actually in. And it's very natural. Again, any child, when they're involved in play, they won't hear, they won't be bothered by if their diapers are full, right? They are fully immersed and immersed in that activity. And it's the same with adults. We don't exist just to be or to be happy or to care about our own, perfecting our own equilibriums or emotional states or whatever. We don't care about that. A sick individual does, a neurotic does. But a healthy individual says, no, I care about things in the world, this or that I want to get involved in, that I want to see done, a value that I want to defend. And if that happens, good. And usually it kind of comes back and we feel good as well. It's a gift. You call it a side effect, right?
Yeah.
But it needs to remain a side effect. Happiness is a side effect of meaning fulfillment. And you cannot chase happiness by itself, because then you're chasing just some inner state. And it usually eludes us when we do that.
Yeah, what you're talking about feels so foundational to me. I'll just, a little bit from my own experiences. I'm thinking of my early 20s and how much I was chasing that happiness and really for so self-involved, right?
There.
Like just thinking about me and looking, navel gazing, that sort of thing. And in basically when I was 26, I had some experiences in my life that sort of rocked my world in a good way, all the hard and also really good ways that brought me to this piece that you're talking about, your grandfather's work of being more connected outside of myself. And this byproduct of once I feel more connected outside of myself and it's not so individualistic in my thinking, that actually brought me back to this kind of core piece of feeling connected to myself, which ultimately brought me more joy and happiness. And that's
great.
It's a cycle, but of course
yes. And he would even say that you've gone full circle.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's good. And he would say, even if you observe the language carefully, he would say, I felt more connected. No, he would say, no, if you are more connected, because let's get away from the feelings.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
Life is not if we stick to the feelings, right? The more we stick to the feelings, the more iffy it can get, Because let's face it, most of the time, even in on a good day, how many moments do we actually experience joy? There was some Russian scientist who kind of counted the minutes, right? And it's very depressing because you find out most of the time we're not especially happy, right? But it's not necessary. You can live a fulfilled life. It doesn't have to be a successful life. It doesn't have to be a happy life even. Not even a happy life. It doesn't need to be a pleasurable life, but it can be a fulfilled life and it's still going to have much more value. And turns out that knowing what you're good for and what you're trying to do in this world, not for yourself, but for the world, so to speak, for others, for the sake of the meaningful task itself, right? The more you do that and the more you overlook yourself, not neglect, that would be countermeaning, right?
Yeah.
The more you overlook yourself in a healthy way by not always keeping one eye on, how does that make me feel, right? The less, it was very sharp with that formulation. He said, the less neurotic you become. So actually, the more, he compared it to the eye, to the human eye. And he said, human eye is a good example for that state of self-transcendence, because a human eye does usually not see anything of itself, right? It doesn't know it's there. What does a human eye see? Well, if you see clouds, then something's wrong with your lens. You got cataract. Or if you see rainbows, he's very much a medical doctor, so he would go into all the symptoms, right? Then maybe there's too much pressure in your eyeball, or you better go see the doctor. A healthy eye, with the exception of looking in a mirror, does not perceive anything of itself. And he said it's the same with a human being. A healthy human being perceives very little of itself. And the more a human being perceives of themselves and reflects and hyper-reflects, which is really the problem more than reflection, it's too much self-reflection.
Hyper-reflection.
The more people are constantly gazing at their own state, the more neurotic they are or they become. And that's often, unfortunately, still today, even fueled by psychotherapy when it's done wrong. where people come in and they already have dealt with a problem so long that they said, okay, I can't solve it on my own, so now I'm going to seek some help, right? So we can assume most of the time people have spent months ruminating about some problem. And then they come to us. And now here's a person who is interested, was showing solely interest in that problem. So it's kind of putting oil into the fire, right? To say, okay, let's focus on that more and let's take it apart and let's go back in history and see where that might have started. All these things. And that's not to say that it's not important to listen when a patient comes and to see, okay, what is the problem, right? But for example, in logotherapy, something that he did was he would consciously, when asking questions and coming to a diagnosis, he would also include other aspects of life. And he would ask the person, okay, and what about that area and that aspect in your life? And then people would hear themselves say, oh, well, that's okay, right? So someone comes in with a problem at work, right? And they say, oh, no, this is so bad. And I told my wife, oh, you told your wife, how's your marriage? Oh, my wife's great. Marriage is great. Oh, you got a good marriage. Okay. Just to acknowledge that can make all the difference, because people, after a while, they'll realize, okay, my life is bigger than that one problem. And that tunnel vision that we all know when we focus on something that's not right in our life is opened a little bit, and people can relax a little bit and say, okay, well, there's some aspects in my life that are under construction, but there are also aspects for which I can be grateful and that are working fine. And I haven't really thought of them in a while.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm just appreciating so much. First, I just got to say, I appreciate you helping me reshape my language even around the whole feeling piece, because yeah, that's so true. Like when we look at what's really accurate and languaging it in a way that really captures, that more holistic view. So I just wanted to name that. Yeah. And then also I feel like I want to name, because I shared that story, I don't want anyone to think I had it figured out at 26 after I went through this experience. There's like so many layers, right? And I was coming back around and around and around to this idea of kind of pulling away the layers of how much I'm looking at this one little corner of my life, or, just focusing on me, and like you're naming, focusing maybe on just what's wrong. And when we have a client come in and they're focusing on a problem, that opening it up, how helpful that is. And it sounds like that's a really important aspect of the therapy you're talking about.
Where do we steer the conversation?
Yeah.
And there's usually there are aspects for which people can be grateful. And even when they talk about some serious misfortune, right, which unfortunately we cannot change, right? Well, there's always one good aspect to that. You're still here telling me about it. You survived. You made it through that. You came out the other end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Not everybody's that lucky.
Yeah. Can I ask a question about, because I think you were differentiating this piece around like spirituality and how loaded that word is for folks. One of the difficulties I think for a lot of people, religion, is this idea of like bypassing, the spiritual bypassing. Like we're just not going to acknowledge these difficulties, these challenges, maybe even traumas. When we bring that piece in, what is the difference between what you were talking about and, spiritual bypassing, or just not acknowledging the difficulties or the traumas? I'm curious to hear you speak to that.
I'm not sure I quite understand. Who does not acknowledge the trauma?
Well, what's the difference for someone who has engaged in a religious practice or even psychotherapy where a trauma or a difficulty has been really bypassed and sort of silver lining, oh, well, just look at the bright side. And they never actually deal with the trauma. But what you're speaking to is very different from that. And I'd love to hear you kind of differentiate a little bit.
Well, yeah, of course. I mean, you can't tell a patient, just look at the bright side. With a hammer. Although there's some truth to that. I mean, we just talked about it. And usually there are some positive aspects or aspects. My grandfather called it, he used that phrase, to squeeze some meaning out of a seemingly hopeless and meaningless situation. And what does that mean? We as human beings always have the ability to transform a predicament, an unchangeable, that's very important, unchangeable situation where there's nothing we can contribute. Everything that happened in the past, right? We can't change it. Because, of course, if there's some situation that causes suffering to myself or others, the priority is to fix it and to change it. Of course, it goes without saying. But there are those situations that we cannot change. And he would say, still, then we can change something. We can adopt an attitude. We are free to choose how we are going to deal with that predicament. and people deal so differently, right?
Mhm.
Take my grandfather himself, for example. He lost his whole family in the Holocaust. Now, if after 1945 he would have returned, to Vienna and found out everyone's dead except for a sister, he would have had every right. It would be understandable if he had said, okay, he decided to lock himself up in his apartment and not come out again or complain or, feel sorry for himself. He would have been justified, right, to do that. And a lot of people are. A lot of bad things happen in this world. But you see how different people deal with their suffering. And he said, to find something meaningful, he was convinced that meaning always exists and that we can find meaningful possibilities. Sometimes they are very hard to actualize, right? Meaning potentials. Even in the direst of circumstances, we can choose what are we going to do with them and maybe even find the most meaningful way of how to deal with that. And that can be, even if it's just learning or teaching others how to avoid that, for example. Think of all the people who, I don't know, they joined became skinheads or whatever, right? Became politically radicalized and found their way out and then go into schools and teach others, this is how I became a neo-Nazi, to prevent someone else from thinking about that and making that same mistake.
Yeah.
That would be retroactively squeezing some meaning out of something that was apparently completely meaningless. I mean, a young person becoming a neo-Nazi and, being hateful and destructive, that's meaningless, right? But that person learning and saying, I've changed and I'm now going to take this and I know best because I'm an expert now on this topic and how it can happen that disoriented youth are kind of drawn into that corner, right? And I'm going to actively see how I can prevent others from doing the same thing. Already, it's been turned from a predicament into, those are the words of my grandfather, from a predicament into a human achievement, into something meaningful, into something that adds a positive to my life, right? If we live and we make mistakes, we put out some good things, some pluses, and we put out some minuses, some negative things. And ultimately, when we die, that's going to be our life, right? All the decisions we made, all the things we actualized, all the possibilities we turned into realities. So we better watch out that we make good choices there and that are meaningful choices. And so by doing that, we can retroactively, and you will find that all the time too, people who say after something bad has happened in their life, who said, well, actually, now looking back 5, 10, 15 years later, I have to say it was for the better. What I did with that changed my life. It changed what I did, or I had to change it. Maybe, people who lose their job or whatever, they say, it's a tragedy and my life is over as I knew it. But then they look back and they say, actually, it was good that this happened because otherwise I would have maybe stayed in the same, habit of doing things as I thought they were right. But this made me grow. It made me overcome some obstacles. It made me think. It made me have some insights about life. And now I can do something that's far more meaningful than I did before.
Yeah, again, I'm just so appreciating the way you're speaking to this, like this whole idea of changing the way that we're relating to the circumstances, to our experiences, and really infusing and acknowledging our own agency in our experience. So it's not just like life is happening to us and this thing happened to me. It's like I'm engaging with it, I'm relating to it in a different way. And that in and of itself can change my experience, and it changes, what I walk away.
And it changes reality. Again, that's just your experience.
Yeah, I love
reality.
that.
You have then impacted other lives in a different way than if you had not had that experience. So that doesn't say whatever happened to you was good per se.
Yeah.
No, of course not. But it can be turned into something, not something good, but something meaningful.
Yeah.
And then something good can grow for others from it.
Yeah. Yeah. And what I can say is that those experiences in my 20s ultimately brought me to this field. And I just have so much gratitude, and I feel so grateful because this is such a rich way to live my life, to be in this work and get to have conversations with folks like you. And I don't think that would have happened. I would have gone, I know exactly probably what I would have done with my life had I not had some of those experiences. So yeah, I just really appreciate you highlighting this part of it, because I know folks, and I think at one time, or met probably many times in my life, I've been really stuck on that piece around, well, this thing happened and it's so hard and it's so traumatic and I feel stuck. And, what you're naming of, again, just changing how we're relating to the experience really changes our reality. So yeah, it's exciting.
Changes the reality.
The reality.
The reality for others too.
Thank you.
Yeah. Again, that self-transcendent element. Yeah.
Yeah, that's so rich. Well, I'm curious to hear more. I feel like there's probably many directions we could take this conversation. And
the meaning of the moment, like we have lots of possibilities, which is good. That is overwhelming. It's like, okay, which one's the most meaningful to talk about now in these couple minutes we have left?
Yeah, thread do we pull on? Well, so to get back to this piece around, we're really wanting to share with folks what is out there in the field. And like you said, there's so many models. They're valuable. They acknowledge really important pieces of this work, but they're not the whole picture. So what other elements of logotherapy do you feel like that is adding to? What else should folks know about?
Well, I mean, that says it pretty well. Other therapies, they concentrate on the how, right?
Mm-hmm.
How are we going to fix this? And that's wonderful. But sometimes it has no effect because if the why comes first, and that's the why, again, self-transcendence. Oftentimes what we do with patients is check their goals. Because if you assume this, again, going back to Freud, well, why do you want psychotherapy or why do you want to fix this? To feel better. Okay. You might get away with that anywhere, but not when you're in a logotherapeutic session, right?
Okay.
Because what's missing is the element of self-transcendence. And that's usually why, say, New Year's resolutions, they don't go very far, right?
No.
I'm going to stop, eating too much chocolate. Okay. Why? Because I'm going to be healthier or I'm going to feel better. Well, you eat that chocolate, you feel good right away, right? Or you smoke that cigarette. I don't know, I'm not a smoker, but I'm glad because I think, it's hard. So if the goal is not a self-transcendent goal, it's not going to carry you far. It's not.
Yeah.
And that makes all the difference. So, and then you can apply all the techniques in the world and it's not going to make a difference because why would I do anything about it, right? If there's no good reason. And I always like to tell this story, which shows it so well. My grandfather had a student who stood out, Elizabeth Lucas, and it was actually my teacher too. And she's one of the best living logotherapists. And she had a patient once who came in and he said, I've tried everything. I want to quit smoking. And now I'm trying this logotherapy or whatever. So what can you tell me, right? And she said, okay, well, why do you want to quit smoking? I said, well, I want to feel better and it's expensive, whatever. Yeah, well, but it still feels good. So none of that was a strong reason. And so, but she kept digging for a why with a little bit of self-transcendence. And finally he said, well, I do have a daughter. She's a child. And I don't really want to have her see her dad smoke because then she might pick up that habit too one day. And I really wouldn't like that. Okay. She zoomed in on that because that was self-transcendent. And she just asked him, do you have a photo of your daughter? This was before cell phone. So she said, yeah, I have it in my wallet. I said, can I see it? Yeah, sure. And she took the photo and she said, do you have a pack of cigarette on you? Of course. Yeah, here it is. Can I have it? Sure. And she took a stapler and she stapled that photo onto the pack of cigarette and handed it back to him. Need I say more? A year later, he came back just to thank her and he pulled out that pack of cigarette with the photo of his daughter still on it, and all the cigarettes were in there. So what had happened? Every time he felt the urge to smoke, and he pulled out that pack of cigarette, he saw the reason not to do it. And that's so often where meaning can be found, in the negative. The question of why implicit, why not? Why not do what's pleasant? Why not always do what you feel like? Why not let every impulse go unchecked? Why not? And that's where meaning comes in. Not smoking is a big sacrifice. Giving up a habit is a big sacrifice. And you need a strong why to do it and to keep following through. And a strong why is something that has not yet, again, something to do with yourself. Just to be healthy is not a worthwhile goal because, well, so you're healthy and then what? You're going to live to 100 and then what? A long life, a healthy life doesn't mean a fulfilled life, doesn't mean a meaningful life. It means nothing. Even in the camps, that's a big stretch now from smoking to the camps. But my grandfather said, even in the camps, if the goal of survival, that's not good enough. Survival for what, right? Survival for what? Life is a chance to do something. Freedom is freedom to something, not just freedom from something. If we free ourselves from a lot of things that previous generations could not free themselves from, right? We have a lot of spare time. Usually we can do that. We have a lot of machines that help us with our everyday, we don't have to spend days washing our clothes, and that's great, right? So we have a lot of freedom to do things. Yeah, we have a lot of freedom from things, but that doesn't necessarily tell us, okay, where am I going with that? What am I doing with that time? How am I going to move forward? What's the what for that I live for? And that was his big discussion with, you're familiar with Abraham Maslow, right? That pyramid of needs is still found in a lot of textbooks, although Maslow himself, after talking with my grandfather, actually retracted that. And he said, yeah, Frankl's right. It's not that way. That all the things we supposedly need. And then if we have all these things, food and security and shelter and income, right? And now there's always the joke, Wi-Fi, right?
Yeah.
And then we can kind of reach the higher goals, and self-actualization was in his case. And my grandfather said, no, actually, it's the other way around. Meaning comes first, because even when all the other things fail, it becomes even more important to know, okay, why am I going, I'm going through a difficult time here. Why do I want to come out the other end? What for, or for whom? For what or for whom? Not what makes me feel good, but for what or for whom is it important that I'm going to still be there when this is over? And that's a goal that carries us, because it takes away that focus from ourselves onto meaningful things in the world.
Beautiful.
So you see the foundation of how he saw humans and what matters in life and what matters to human existence. And he actually, again, he said that's nothing new. And oftentimes people intuitively feel that if they haven't been indoctrinated otherwise, right?
Yeah.
Oh, it's all about yourself and fulfilling your needs and keeping your boundaries. And in every relationship, you need to see how much you get out of it. And he said, that's not true. That's not a healthy human being. That's already a warped image, so to speak. But ultimately, a healthy human being doesn't even reflect about meaning. You don't need to go to a logotherapist. It's usually when something goes wrong there, when we find no meaning. So sort of like oxygen. When it's lacking, we notice it. As long as it's there, we live happily. But meaning often becomes a problem when it's not there. We don't see. He would say it's always there. But when we don't see it, and we're kind of floundering and don't know which direction to go and what are the meaningful tasks that we should move towards and that are worthy of our time and effort.
Yeah. I'm really appreciating, again, just everything you're bringing from this. And I wonder here in our last, because I'm mindful of the time, I wonder what else, if there's anything that you feel left unsaid or anything that you would want our listeners to really take from this conversation.
Oh, well, a lot of things, but I think maybe what you see from this conversation is that it's a very different mindset. And in order to fulfill meaning, we don't have to be fully functional. We don't have to be healthy physically or even mentally. We don't have to be highly educated. It's something, again, that puts us all on the same level, including, therapist and patient, as people, as beings. And we can rely on that. And that's maybe also the beauty of when you don't know what technique to apply, to rely on that even people who've maybe lived very wrongly and adopted bad habits for whatever reason, or wound up in deep neurosis, as we see so often nowadays, that there's still a core, there's a healthy person in there that is still looking for meaning and how to make their lives count and how to make a difference in the world, a meaningful difference in the world. And once you uncover that, either by going into the past, so we do go into the past in logotherapy, but we don't look for the problems, but we look for the traces of where people can say, oh, well, back then that was good. There was a moment, there was an activity, right? There was something that I did that was actually meaningful. And I'm glad I could do this, or I could experience this. Meaning comes in many forms. What we do, what we put into this world, what we take out of this world, experiences. And the third would be the attitudes that we adopt. Usually that comes into play when we cannot change anything. But there's plenty of meaning, and usually people have been in touch with something that's of value, and we can rely on that. And there's not so much work that we need to do oftentimes, because when people remember that, their focus is already on that. Okay, I can pick up where I left the thread. And what really matters is what happens now, what happens next even if we could cure past injuries by looking back again and again, still you waste a lot of time when life goes on, right? We're finite beings, so there's an eternity to self-reflect, right? So the question is always, the healing can only happen in the now. What do you want to do with your life, with all the bad things and good things that you've accumulated? You would often use the barn metaphor. That might be a good ending. You could look at life like a barn, and like the farmer, right, who's bringing in the harvest from the fields. And so when we're young, there's a lot of harvest, a lot of meaning and experience, good crop, but also some stones and thistles, things you don't want to collect, but we also still collect them, right? And we bring them into our barn, the barn of life, so to speak. But what counts is, as we progress in life, the fields become more empty because we cut the grass, the weeds, right? Mm-hmm. And we often just look at the stubble field of what's not there anymore. And we forget that what we have experienced and lived and created and endured bravely, all these things are realities now, and they are stored in the barn of our life, metaphorically. And they're there, and nobody can take them away from there. Even death has no power over what has been. It's the safest form of being, actually. So my grandfather often said, I don't know if it's such a good thing, or so logically even, to always admire the youth. They have, preferably when things go well, they have a lot of possibilities ahead of them, but they can be robbed of that anytime because life happens, disease strikes, or illness, or death. But what happens to the realities that we have put into our barn? And old people usually have a lot of realities in their barns, things that happen and that cannot be undone. And that's like a treasure. So sometimes in life, even when you're not old yet, looking back and saying, okay, what's in my barn? What are the good things that are there? What are the stones and thistles that are in there as well? And is it more stones and thistles or good crop, right? And as I go back into the field again, how can I make sure that I make good decisions and that I bring in more good crop? That's a shift of perspective too, and something that maybe enables us to also be a little more conscientious, is that right? Or conscious of the time that we have, and that pursuing this kind of idea of an ideal state of being is not really achievable. And if it's achievable, is it important? Is it that important? Or isn't it more important to see, how can I make a difference in that world? What are the crops that need to be cut, that need to be harvested, the things that need to be realized and should be realized sooner than later? Because again, all of our life, there's no safety in life. We don't know what happens next. Tragedy can happen tomorrow, right? What would you be sad about if you hadn't rescued it into your barn, into eternity, into the safest state of being where you have done it? And let's focus on that. Let's just talk about that. And oftentimes that just makes the biggest difference. And it makes the other things that are so emotionally present, right, and overwhelming, it puts those into perspective.
Yeah, thank you for leaving us with that beautiful metaphor. I'm going to be thinking of the barn of life. What am I bringing in? What am I harvesting? What am I choosing to pull from? Yeah. Thank you, Alex.
Yeah.
I really
Thank you.
enjoyed this conversation. And
I do too.
I'm sure there's folks who would love to know how to get in contact with you and your work.
Yeah.
Where can they do that?
Well, a couple of years ago, I started working with the institute in Bamberg, which is an institute of logotherapy. And we're doing a online course in logotherapy, and that's what I do most of my time now. So if you want, you can visit us at www.logotherapy-online.com.
Okay.
That's a course. And there I am.
Fantastic.
And then there's the Institute of Logotherapy in America, the Viktor Frankl Institute of America. And there you can kind of dabble into logotherapy a little bit. There's a little course there that's automatic. You can take that and get to learn a little bit more about logotherapy if you're interested. So, yeah.
Fantastic. And for folks who don't know, you are a filmmaker. You've got some work out there in the world, of course, with Viktor Frankl, and then also Milton Erickson, I believe. You've got some really impactful films out there, and you're doing important work in various fields. So
yeah, they're available on Vimeo.
Okay, great. Fantastic. Great. We'll put some links in the show notes so folks can access some of these places where they can find you. And thank you again. I just so appreciate you taking the time and sharing, so much of the work that you're continuing on, this torch that was passed. So
likewise.
Yeah, enjoy it.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. To find more information about our guest, check the show notes or visit us at complextraumatrainingcenter.com/transforming trauma. You can also connect with us in other ways. We're on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. As a mental health professional, your commitment to healing and growth inspires us. We at the Complex Trauma Training Center are committed to supporting you in your well-being and success. That's why we're honored to invite you to our Space Program 2025, an inner development program of support and self-discovery for therapists on the personal, interpersonal, and transpersonal levels. This interactive experiential learning program is designed to support self-care and self-discovery for therapists, exploring internally, relationally, and transpersonally. CTTC faculty will welcome you into a professional community of therapists that are seeking to create greater effectiveness and resilience in our professional lives. As CTTC faculty Brad Kammer says, the intent is that this program will help us not only become more effective therapists, but also love our work more. Please visit complextraumatrainingcenter.com and secure your spot in the 2025 Space Program. Thanks to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for producing and editing, to Elisa Sponseller for our album art, and to Brad Kammer for the creation of this podcast. We look forward to building community and connection with you and changing the world by transforming trauma.